Now we're on the top of Daf Tesvavam and Beis. El Amarova Afilu, who, meaning the Shliach, the Acher, and somebody from the Shuk, who's not a Shliach, they both testify together, Me'idim al Chasimas Yada Sheni. Awesome. Now this is really strange. It seems that the Shliach is made both on the Ksiva and on the Chasima, but he brought a buddy along, someone in a Shuk, and he connected to that buddy, so to speak, to make a kat, to testify on the other Chasima. But again, he, the Shliach himself, is testifying on the other Chasima. So it's a full-fledged B'fani Nechta. The only problem is he brought in a friend. This is what I call a Mosiv Gorea. And the get is possible. And why? Because now that he's mitzaref another aid to be made on one of the two chasimos, that aidus on the other chasima is not acceptable. The get is possible because we're missing an aidus on the said chasim, my timer. Well, what's the reason why you established that there was no aidus on the second chasima? We have both the shliach and echad min hashuk. And the Gemara answers, Asi lechlufe bekim stars the alma. People will make the mistake that let's connect or equate kiyum shtaros with kiyum get. And we saw in kiyum get ayidei shliach, and therefore we can have kiyum shtaros. Now, in the case of kiyum get ayidei shliach, there's only one aid. In kiyum shtaros bi'alma, we need two aidim. Now, why would anyone? It's obvious to any spectator that this is a special halach in get. If the shliach is a one-man show and he testified fani nechtam, then everybody knows that's a separate din in get. They're not going to come to conclusions that you could be mekayim shtos the alma with one aid. But here they saw another aid come in to testify in the chasima together with the shliach. Apparently, this is kiyum shtaros. And yet, if you're equating this with kiyum shtaros, they're going to come to the conclusion that even if there was no second aid, it was only the shliach, then we can mekayim the shtar with one aid. The kanofik nechi riva de momona pumi dechad sad. Now we have the following. We have the shliach being made as a one-man show on one chasima. That covers half the edus. And the shliach together with another person in Ashuk verifying the other chasima. And it comes out now that the shliach played 3/4 of the role of edus. And based on that, in a parallel case, in kiyum shtaros the alma, Beis Din is going to rely on this to be motzi mama miches kasa. Maski for Rav Ashi doesn't accept Rav. Mi kamidi de ilu masik le ilu kula di bura kosher. If the shliach would have been left alone, without being shepherded, without being bothered and interfered by another aid, and he says b'fani nechtam, and he's made on both chasimos. So certainly that's kosher. I mean, that's our Mishnah. But hashtadika chad ba'adeh, because somebody jumped into the fray and he joined together with the shliach to testify the second chasima, apostle? Doesn't make any sense. You already had with the testimony of the shliach a full-fledged hechsher. I get it. B'fani nechtam. Elama Rava, what's the case? Rav Ashi, excuse me, what's the case? Afilu omanihu eid hasheni pasul. Even if the shliach says, I signed on this get together with someone else, and now he's testifying on his own chasima, pasul. what's going on over here. The shliach certainly is never to say that I signed, I was an aide. So why shouldn't we believe him when he testifies on the other chasima that it is an authentic chasima? And once again, Rav Ashi applies that principle that we saw before, okulo this, okulo that. Okulo b'kiyum haget. Okulo b'takonos chachamim. What's kula b'kiyum haget? If you have two chasimos, then you makayim b'kiyum haget, the regular kiyum, the way the chachamim established the takana, which is the way you makayim all shtaros, when you have two eidim to testify that these are authentic signatures. Or kula karas chachamim, that the separate didn't get, that you can makayim the get through the edus of the shliach. When he testifies funny nechtam, he's considered as if he testified with another aid. But here you tell me that half of the kiyum was done in one way, and the other half of the kiyum was done in another way. Half of the kiyum was done through kiyum shtaros, when the aid testifies, that's my signature. And half is testifying through the special nemanis of the shliach of the takonas get. And therefore it's possible. Tonight, our Mishnah says, now the Gemara is going to slug up Rav Chizda from our Mishnah. The Shliach says, B'fanei nechtav kula, B'fanei nechtam chetzio. And in other words, he cannot testify on both chasimos, because he only saw one chasima. Possible, get is possible. So the Gemara says, Idach, what about the second signature? What do we know about the second signature? If we don't have any testimony whatsoever in the second signature, is then I don't need the Tana to teach me this. Hashta. The high komasid. It's a case of two people who brought again. High komasid akula chasima. The high komasid akula chasima. Possible. Is chetzia boy? Even if you have two edim, I'm sorry. Even if you have what? A testimony on each of the chasimos by two different people, it's possible. And now you don't even have a testimony on the second chasima. I don't need the Tana to tell me that if the shliach can only testify on the chasim of one of the two chasimas, that the get is possible. So we have no choice but to assume that the Tana is telling me with this extra halacha, a new din mechudash, that you couldn't derive from the halacha of echad om farin nechta, that the get is possible. So what is that din mechudash that the Mishnah wants to be mechadish? And now we're going to apply the principle of tafasta meruba lo tafasta, famous principle at the end of Masechet Yomi, which tells me that we always take the minimum chidush. Now, what would be a justifiable minimum chidush? In the three-way machlokas, it could be el okir rava, okir of ash. It could be a chidush of rava, that if the shliach and another person from the shuk are testifying together on one chasima, the addition of that one person from the shuk passes the get. Or according to Rav Ashi, even if the shliach says, I am the get, I am the aid that's signed on this star, on this get, possible. But lafuki min Rav Chizda, it cannot be that the chiddush of the Mishnah is to teach me Rav Chizda's chiddush, that there are two eidim that testify on the second chasima, the get is possible, because tafasta meruba lo tafasta. If the Tana would hold like the din of Rav Chizda, the apostle to get, he should have said it explicitly. And for the fact that he didn't say it, it means he doesn't hold. Rav Chizda, Ulitamech, according to you who asked this kasha, that the Mishnah has to be mechadish me a new chiddush. I don't understand the Mishnah. Why? Because the Mishnah opens up by saying b'fanei nechtav, avalo b'fanei nechtav is possible. What do I need that for? Lamali. It says later on in the Mishnah, in the third din, that b'fanei nechtav kulo, b'fanei nechtav chetzio, the get is possible. How much more so if there's no edus at all on the part of the shliach on the chasimos? The get is certainly possible. Ella, therefore, you have no choice, says Rav Chizda, in interpreting this Mishnah, unless you activate the principle in the literary structure of the Mishnah of lo zu af zu katani, where the Mishnah starts with a lesser chiddush and establishes the basics, and then goes on to a greater chiddush and a greater chiddush. So that's why the Mishnah opens up with the simple din, where he did not testify on both the ksiva and the chasima, and then a chiddush gadol yoser, and it goes on and on and on. So again, if there's no edus at all on the chasimos, because all the shliach said is b'fanei nechtav, the get is possible. Then the Mishnah goes on to tell us lozu ela afzu, even if you have edus on one of the two chasimos, the get is possible. And hachinami lozu afzu katani. The next part of the Mishnah is also organized in the structure or the principle of lozu afzu. And first the Tana tells us that if there's edus on one chasima and only on one chasima, there's no edus at all on the second chasima to get as possible. And then the Mishnah goes on to tell us that even if there's edus on the second chasima, but one of them is saying b'fanei nechtav, and one of them is saying b'fanei nechtav, the get is possible. Now, once the Gemara invokes the principle of Rav Chizda of O Kula B'Kiyum, O Kula B'Takaras Chachamim, the Gemara brings another statement of Rav Chizda in Hilchos Shabbos that also presents that kind of a structure. And we're talking about Arba Rishuyos L'Shabbos, Rishuyach, Rishurab, and Karmelis, and Mokum P'tur. Rav Chizda is going to address the question of mechitzos. We know that a Rishus HaYochid has to be mukaf mechitzos gvos yud tfachim. But what happens when you have a subterranean ma'ara? And halach in such a case is that if the subterranean ma'ara is 10 tfachim below ground level, then the bottom of that ma'ara is considered Rishus HaYochid because there are mechitzos on the outside sfas habor. Same thing would be if you had a har, and the har goes up 10 tfachim. The top of that har is called a Rishus HaYochid, and the mechitzos go all the way up to the top. Now, what happens if you have a situation where you need to add 5 tfachim subterranean with 5 tfachim above ground level? Can you combine the two such that the bottom of the bar is considered Rishus HaYochid? Amar Rav Chizda, Gided or Gidud Chamisha. So you have this Ta'ala, and there's 5 tfachim up to ground level, but now he has a Mechitza Chamisha tfachim that surrounds the Ta'ala, and it's 5 tfachim above ground level, ein mitztarfim. Achiyeh o kula mechitza kula begidut. Again, the same kind of structure as we saw before with regard to kiyum shtaros and kiyum aget. You need either all this or all that. So either you have a mechitza that's asar tfachim high, or you have a madron going down of a ta'ala that's 10 tfachim subterranean. That's fine. But in this case, that you have 5 and 5, we can't connect the two, and therefore the mokum is a karmelis. Dorash Maremar paskin against Rav Chizda, Gidul Chamisha, Mechitza Chamisha Mitztarfin, Vilgusam Mitztarfin, which, by the way, is a chumrah, because now we're establishing Rishus HaYochid instead of a karmelis. And if you would throw something from the ground level down to the bottom of this bar, and the bar is only 5 tachim deep, he'd be chayiv for hotzah mishus l'shus. Boy, ilfa had a suffix. Again, the same kind of structure of okulo this way, okulo that way, in netilas yadayim. Now, the honest truth is, Rabbi, I wish we had a month to spend on the next little sugya. There's so much here. But we were just doing it on the surface level. Boy, ilfa, yadayim tahoros lechatzoin or aim tahoros lechatzoin? Can you be mitayar yadayim piecemeal? Hechidami. And the Gemara offers one suggestion and rejects it, another suggestion and rejects it, until we finally figure out what is the scenario about which ilfa is so. You have two people who are washing their hands. Miravius achas. So you have a kli. The kli has in it one full revius. And two people are washing their hands from the same revius in that kli. Now, what that means is that each person of the two people is getting only a revius of Mayim on each hand. He's not getting, right? Which is half of a quarter. I guess you call it an eighth. And yet, if that's the suffix of ilfa, whether or not both of them were b'tar yadayim with half of the share of revius, guess what? The Mishnah at the very beginning of Masechet Yadayim addresses this question. Vatnan, may revius from a kli that has a full share of revius, notlim liyadayim liechad vafil shnayim. Even two people could wash their hands from that revius mayim, one after the other. And even though the second guy will not have a share of revius poured on his water, but as long as the Rishon was notelis yadav from a kli that had a share of revius, then the shady could also wash his hands from that kli. Now you did in the chefts of the kli. So it could not be that ilfa had a suffix about this when it's explicit in the Mishnah. Elos, and now try another option. The Gemara is not going to be happy with this one either. There's only one person. But to call mashi chada chada yade, he washes one hand, and then he washes a second hand. He did not wash both his hands simultaneously. And now he has what's called in Ilfa's language an atil lechatzon. Is that mitaras hayadayim? Who says once again, it's explicit, not in the first parak of Yadayim, but in the second parak of Yadayim. But Tanan, hanotel yodo achas benetila, the achas b'shtifa, yodov tahoros. What happened over here? He poured the kli on one of his hands, kit hakodesh chachamim. On the other hand, he dipped his hand into a river, and the river has arboim soy mayim. And the Mishnah says Yadayim Tahoros. So you see that even though he wasn't notel both Yadayim b'vas achas, but rather first he did a shtifa, and then he did, first he did an atila, and then he did a shtifa. He did an atila on one yad, and a shtifa on another yad, but zecher zeh is nevertheless Yadayim Tahoros. So why did Ilf have a suffix about this? Ella. Now we have the third scenario. What was the suffix of Ilfa? The Kamashi palga de yod. He only washed half of his hand, then he dried it, and then he washed the second half of his hand. The Gemara says, no, that can't be a suffix of Ilfa. Amri de Bei Rav Yanai, You can't wash half your hand, dry it, and then wash the other half of the hand. Lo tzricha deika mashke tofeach al manas latpia. What happened is that after he washed half the hand, he didn't dry it totally. It was still damp enough that it could wet something else. And then he washed the second half of the hand. And the question is whether the mashke that's left over after the first half of his hand, that dampness, which is called tofeach hamanas latpiach, is that a machaber that connects both of his netilos and makes it into one netil. The Gemara says, wait a minute. Mashke tofeach mai havi. And now the Gemara is going to quote a Mishnah in the 8th parak of Taharos to prove that mashke tofeach, if it's on his hand, that's not considered a mashke at all. And again, this we're going to have to pick up tomorrow, but let's just read a couple lines here from the Mishnah in Taharos on Daf Tezayin and Aleph. Hanitzok v'akatafris u'mashke tofeach eino chibur lo letuma v'lo letar. So what you have is water that's pouring down from a receptacle, from a kli. And it goes down and creates like a vertical line from top to bottom. That's called nitzel. Then you have something called katafris. What's katafris? The water is going from on top, let's say on the top of a mountain, and now it's going down on a slope. And then you have mashke tofeach, a mashke that has a very limited amount of dampness. If you would touch it with your finger would get wet from this mashke, but the mashke doesn't have enough lachus such that a yad anogas bo tucha lahavir lachus makamach. In other words, somebody's hand touching it would get wet, but if he touches someone else, it would not get him wet. In all other cases, all of these cases above, eino chibur, you don't connect one mashke with another, not letuma. Letuma means, let's say, someone who's pouring mashke from a kli tar into mashke in a kli that's tameh. So we don't say that the nitzok, meaning the flow, will connect the mashke in both kelim as if they were in the same kli, which would mean that the mashke in the kli elyon would be tameh. No, we don't say that. The mashke in the kli elyon remains tar because it's not. There's no din of nitzok. That's as far as tumah, below l'tara. What about a mikvos? Let's say I have two mikvos. Each one of them is missing a little bit to be mashal in the shear of our boim sa. The minimal shear for hechsher mikvah. And now you have either nitzok or katafris or mashke tofeach that is connecting the two mikvos. That would make up together a shear of our boim sa. That chibur is not a chibur. But in any event, we see clearly from the Mishnah that mashke tofeach is not a chibur. And therefore, once again, we have no room for ilfas safek. Can you achieve an atilas yadayim lechatzoim in a situation where, when he was notel chatzi yado, there was still a mashke tofeach al manas latpiach, and then he was notel the second half of his yad, because the mashke tofeach is not a chibur, and it's as if he washed half his yad, dried it, and then went ahead and washed a netila on the second half of his hand, and that's not tvila. And then where it says lo tzricha dicha tofeach lehatpiyah, let's differentiate from the Mishnah and Taros to the suffix of ilfa. The suffix of ilfa was not about a case where the extra water that was on his hand for the first netila is tofeach latpiyah. That was the case that ilfa vacillated about. Tofeach latpiyach, if you would touch the top half of your hand that he was notel b'tchila, you would get wet. And not only that, you're so wet that you can wet something else. That's where Ilfa had a suffer. And even though in the Mishnah Taros, we're going to say that's only Tofach is not a Chibur, but Tofach Lat Piach maybe would be a Chibur, and that's exactly the suffix of Rav Chisda, of Ilfa. And now the Gemara say, Honami Tanya, we even have that din in a Brisa, and that's Tofech Lat Piach Chibur. The Brisa comments on the Mishnah Taros and says, okay, if it was only Tofech, it's not a Chibur. But if it's Tofech Leat Piach, then it is a Chibur. And the Gemara is going to now differentiate between Mikvos and Etilas Yadayim, and that Mirz Hashem will be our subject, B'li Neder, Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, for tomorrow. Take this opportunity to wish you a great day.